Welcome back, everyone. In the previous episode, we looked at a reactive approach, and we've already talked a little bit about proactive as well. We've talked about being recall ready, and we've talked about proactive. We're going to talk about perhaps what could be viewed as another way of looking at proactive approaches to preventing a recall in the first place. Let's look at a preventative approach. Again, we're back with Bob Manning, author of In the Midst of a Recall. And in your book, you talk about preventative, which I think is probably easy to look at in terms of, the whole an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure
Mhm.
element. But let's talk about it in terms of real context of a recall. What do you define, or how do you define as being preventative in the first place?
Yeah, that's another great question. And we talked a little bit about earlier with regard to, people talk about proactive and the preventative, and is there this gray area in between? And one of the areas that I look at, I mean, everyone talks about preventative maintenance, right? And actually, preventative maintenance is a big part of recall prevention. So using that as the context, I mean, when you look at it from a proactive perspective, like, and from a proactive standpoint, we talked about this earlier. It's like, what's some of the items and data and trends that are emerging that could possibly bring threats and issues to our business. But then more importantly, what's the next step and what are the preventative measures or steps that we will put in place to prevent it from happening. So when you look at it from a prevention standpoint, like with maintenance, it's a matter of, okay, we're going to change these components at this set frequency. We're going to do it regardless of the condition of those components. And actually, we talked a little bit about airlines earlier, like their preventive maintenance protocols are like these components will be changed at this amount of hours, regardless. That doesn't matter if they look brand new and you pull them out. You're actually changing them. But when you look at that, and actually airlines are a good industry to look at. Obviously, we've had some challenges over the last couple of weeks, but when you think about how many planes are flying and how much maintenance is required on these planes, not many of them have issues, right? Like just like some ridiculously small percentage. And so by understanding the proactive and in the emerging trends in the data, then taking those preventative steps and those schedules to determine what preventative measures that you'll put in place, that will reduce the likelihood of a recall.
Well, I mean, one could say, looking at the airlines as an example, right? Was it
Mhm.
human error? Was it equipment failure? Well, the last
Sure.
thing you want to have is equipment failure compounding human error.
Sure. That's
Um,
right.
but what I see in addition to whether it's maintenance and equipment engineering and sanitation is when companies invest into, for instance, X-rays to X-ray their product before it continues down the line, or
Yep.
companies that invest in more rapid testing, companies that invest in digital thermal intelligence to make sure that proper temperatures, hot foods are hot, cold foods are cold. And rather than just having a digital analog thermometer on the spot, they actually have data that's being collected and even sent to a remote location that could indicate evidence before equipment failure fails, as opposed to waiting until your
Right.
refrigerator dies. You look at the idea of companies that look towards rapid testing. There are companies that they want test results to come back before they ship their products across state
Yep.
lines or to other countries. Whereas a vast majority of companies, they don't even get results back until
Right.
after it's already been distributed. And now it's like in someone else's backyard, right?
Right.
Literally, and in other states, it's their problem now. So there's
Yep.
a lot of different ways of looking at a preventive approach. Why do you think that companies are starting now to invest economically and culturally, I guess, if you will, into more preventative approaches.
Yeah, I think, a lot of it comes down to they're seeing the pains associated with not having product, right? I think a lot of it goes to, and I've said this before, on the operational side, it all comes down to the economic impacts of the business. So, like if they're out of stock or if they don't have product to sell, well, then they're not bringing in revenue. And so what they do is they focus on how do we turn our products quicker? How do we get them to the market faster? How do we get them there safer? And what they're now doing is relying on technology. And so if they can do that and it allows them like a rapid test method that you brought up, great example. In the past, some companies, and there's many companies still doing this, they'll incubate their product for X amount of days, then they'll plate it for X amount of days, they'll read it for a day, and then they'll ship it. And that total might be 10 days in total or whatever. Well, if I could do a rapid method test where they incubate it for 12, 24, 48 hours and they get an immediate result, now they've picked up 6 to 8 days of product that they can now ship. So now that means they don't have to build these big massive warehouses and they don't have to. So there's a lot of economics. And I think what's happening now is that as companies focus on, you'll hear executives, they'll say, some will say we're going to focus on the top line, we're going to focus on the bottom line. Well, the bottom line focuses how do I reduce costs and move my product? And so they're identifying that if I use these methods, these technological advances, it allows me to sell more product. And I think that's one of the main reasons people are looking at it. I mean, I'd love to say they're looking at it because of consumers and safety and all of this. But again, business leaders are focused on turning a profit. And so, how can they do that faster? And that's one of the ways they can do it.
I've heard additional conversations around this, everything from um, this is how we make sure that we don't want to have our insurance premiums raised on us because we're not doing these
Sure.
works. I've
Yeah.
heard with Boar's Head that there were companies that because of Boar's Head, they dropped them as their supplier because of that loss of trust
Right.
or loss of confidence. Either
Yeah.
way, you don't want to find out that your inability to make sure you have safe product and you can recall it effectively is losing you business. It's not even losing you sales, it's losing your distributors or your
Right.
retailers, things of that nature. When you look at the work that companies like Costco and Walmart are, look at what they put into making sure that their suppliers, you don't get onto their shelves unless you meet certain requirements now. It's
Right.
because they're sick of their company as the retailer being basically included in terms of who are the defendants in this lawsuit. And I know that that's a completely legal, economic way of looking at the motivation for doing this, but it is a reality in terms of the fact that you have to take these things in consideration. I do think
Right.
too that you look at the idea of people, if not losing their jobs, losing hours, right? We looked
Sure.
at when Chipotle had some of their outbreaks, and some of those were due to employees being sick with norovirus. And literally, why
Right.
did they get sick? Because other employees were sick with
Right.
norovirus. And, they were required to stay home until they were well again. They weren't paid to stay home.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
whether you're
Yeah.
losing your job or you're just not working your hours, there's many different dimensions of looking at why this kind of preventive approach has a lot of advantages.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, as people go through, one of the biggest things to do is to learn from your mistakes or learn from your failures and build those into your systems. And, I talk about it with regard to, lessons learned and proactive measures and things like that. It's really, okay, this happened. How are we now going to go back to our system and improve our system based on what our findings are? And what companies should do is look at it with small issues, not so much the big ones, right? And so when you look at, I tell some clients today, it's like I would focus on, aside from many other things, but look at your internal failures and look at how your internal failures, like look deep into what caused it and go back and fix that. Because that could be a potential time bomb waiting to go off, right? So just go back and really drive it to its root cause. And when you start doing that on all of your failures, it's going to point to a number of different things. It could point to sanitation, it could point to GMPs, it could point to leadership, it could point to, just general operations. It could point to training, right? A lot of people, I know today training is, we don't really talk about it with regard to prevention, but it's a huge component of prevention because you actually mentioned earlier, like if it's a mechanical failure, is it human failure? Like one's going to exacerbate the other. So if you have a mechanical failure and you have your human aspect of it now overreacting, that just causes all sorts of problems. And I go back to the pilot that was piloting the Delta flight. I think that person probably, again, I don't know what caused the issue, and I'm sure there's many stories that are going to come out, but it's how that pilot controlled the plane to, okay, it flipped over, but it didn't roll over end and explode. And so when you look at it from a mechanical perspective within an operation and taking the training piece and really training to comprehension, because what we're seeing today is it's the checkbox. Up, they went through GMPs. Up, they went through, sanitation. But do they really understand what they're doing? Like I know a lot of companies will do a one and done training. How much you really learning when you're cramming? I sit you in a room for 2 days and I bombard you with 16 hours of training and you walk out. How much of that did you really retain and can comprehend?
Yeah.
So I think, prevention is a multitude of different things, but it's learning from your mistakes, it's building them back into your systems to make them stronger, and then it's making sure that you're touching on them from a comprehension perspective with employees that should really drive that to a better place.
Well, I would imagine too that anyone who, and I'm going to be pretty soon, within like the next 2 weeks on a plane here. And you think things like, I hope this pilot is trained and certified and has certain number of hours, and I hope that they've gone through flight simulators that have include crashes like this, and
Mhm.
that the entire flight crew has gone through training and has gone through drills and has gone through this. Because ultimately, again, whether it was equipment failure or human failure, it doesn't matter at that moment when
Right,
those lives are in peril. But the fact, again,
right,
the fact that everyone survived that crash would indicate that you had to have had some proactive measures involved. You had
mhm,
to have some preventative measures involved, and even the way we can look at the reactive, post crash type incident, it all comes down to the fact that everyone got out alive.
right,
We see a
right,
lot of outbreaks and recalls where, unfortunately, we cannot say that in the
right,
end, all consumers came out alive.
right,
And if we look at that in terms of how serious it is, in terms of the reactive, the preventative, the proactive, and the readiness aspects of it, this is not a one and done type of a preparation step.
right.
This is like you said, an ongoing continuous improvement plan and cycle that we have to look at.
Yeah, and you actually bring up a very good point there. With all the recalls that are happening right now, I mean, the ones that are, the class ones are publicized. And when you look at those, and this is where you encourage, whether it's companies, students, clients, whoever they are, I tell people go back to those recalls and look to see what happened and compare it to your operation. Because you may find some glaring issues. Now, unfortunately, sometimes there's not a lot of detail as to what happened or why it happened unless it's in a 483 or some report. But you can get some information out, like people like yourself or myself that have been in this world for a long time. Like I can look at them and say, oh, I know exactly what happened there. And I know exactly what I could do to prevent that. But I'd encourage people to go out and look at their operations and compare it to some of the failures that they're seeing in the world today because it might give them some insight to say, okay, well, there's the link and there's some exposure that we have. And this is how I sell it to the executive team as to why we need to do it.
Yeah, great point. And to add to that, I've been in situations where going through certain trainings, and there were people from companies that would talk about likelihood and severity as being zero. And I shake my head. It's like, do you think that a airline industry can say that a likelihood and severity of catastrophic failure is zero? If you're
Right.
a food company and you're thinking that you are immune or you don't have enough evidence to show that there's anything greater than a zero in terms of likelihood or severity of a recall or an outbreak tied to your product and consumers being harmed, then you're not looking hard enough.
That's right. That's right. I actually had, well, there's, there's a, if you're not producing anything, there's where your likelihood and probability are zero, right?
Yeah,
But I actually just
exactly.
had this discussion with somebody. I remember running a plant and had an SQF auditor come in and say, you got a, you didn't find anything, got a 99. And I said to them, I said, well, I need you to now go back out to the floor and find something,
Yeah.
right? Because we're paying you to find things. I can't imagine that we're that good. And we're not, because it's like I've gone out there and I've seen, I could give you 100 things that you could hit me on. I won't, but, because then my boss would probably choke me. But, the reality is like you go out and find something that I can now use to make us better, right? And so,
Yeah, before we move on to our last episode here, there's a great point you brought up here. The CEO of Chipotle during those outbreaks, he continued to get his $15 million Christmas bonus because none
mhm,
of the measures of his performance were based on food safety. That is problematic, but also problematic is the fact that you hear sometimes, I don't want to hear any problems because I don't want any problems to be, my performance to reflect on any problems. A true leader's performance is not to be measured by the fact that there's zero problems out there. That's
mhm,
impossible. I think that a
yeah,
true leader, whether it's a legal advisor, or, legal counsel, or some other executive, should be measured by the fact that they actively and aggressively looked for problems and they made sure these problems
right.
were resolved.
That's right. Yeah. I chuckle a little bit when you're telling that story. It actually made me think of an issue where I was sitting down with a senior leader who we were creating a new position. Um, and I said to them, I'll never forget, I had my pad, my pen. I said, okay, like what are your expectations and what do you want this person to accomplish? And they said, no issues. I said, excuse me? He said, no issues. I said, I don't understand. Like, what do you mean by that? He goes, this position can have no issues. Okay. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't even know. I
Yeah.
don't even know what to say to that.
Yeah, it's unrealistic.
Right.
It's unrealistic. But again, I think that the clear message is find the issues,
Right. That's right.
resolve the issues, act proactively and in a preventative approach, and be
Yeah.
ready for when we, actually have to have a recall.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's one of those things. If you think that you're immune, you're gonna have a hard time when you find out that your reality is now shattered.
Yeah. And that brings up another great point, though. Not only resolve the issues, but now look to your other operations and your other, if you have other plants, like look beyond your four walls. And this is something that we had seen where it's like we had an issue here, and then as we started to dig into it, it's like, okay, well, it might be over here and it might be over here. And so now that just expands. So you bring up a great point. Like look at it here, but now do we have exposure elsewhere?
Were you surprised at all when at first Boar's Head said it was all about their plant in Jarrett, Virginia? And then after a while, yeah, they found the same sanitation failures in many other plants.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, this is where I go upstream, right? Who like I believe that's a complete leadership failure.
Yeah, upstream. Very good point.
Yeah.
I mean, if they truly found that there were no problems in other plants, then that would say the problem is over here.
Hmm.
But to suspect that there wasn't problem elsewhere,
Yeah.
you're just not looking
Right.
enough.
That's right. Right. And it goes back to leadership, it goes back to culture, it goes back to foods, yeah, like all the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
And these are things like those are companies like I'd love to go into and fix. Like meaning like somebody said, look, can you take the CEO spot for a year or two? No problem, because I know like I will eat that meat after the thing is cleaned up, I'll eat that meat, right? And that's a judge. There's your litmus test right there.
Well, let's do this. Let's come back for one more episode, some final thoughts and takeaways, and then put but an opportunity to close a brief look into your book in the midst of a recall.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.